argument for the existence of God. It's called the moral argument for God's existence. Now, with all classes of arguments for God's existence, there are variations, there are varieties, there are different formulations that fit into the same family of arguments. So there are actually several moral arguments for God's existence. And I'll talk to you about basically what they have in common and then give you a couple of different versions of them, focusing especially on one that I find to be the most convincing personally and the most helpful apologetically. Now, tomorrow morning, I'm going to be giving you my own definition of Christian apologetics. So I'm going to save that for tomorrow, and then I'm going to give you what I consider to be a very useful way of organizing the evidence for Christian belief into a systematic, kind of coherent whole. So that rather than having one argument for this and another argument for that and then some other argument for a third thing that we believe, we're trying to organize the arguments, the evidences, so that there's some structure to the whole that becomes more and more convincing as you go through the sequence. So it's a series of steps, if you will, that help to illustrate what is so comprehensively and systematically convincing about Christianity. But at any given point in a conversation with someone, you might just dip into the paradigm without going through the preceding steps somewhere in the middle, or never get to the end with a particular person. And then sometimes you can start from the beginning and get right on to the end because you have a captive audience or there's a lot of curiosity on their part. I had a conversation with a fellow flying home from back east after speaking, and I might tell this story in greater detail later, but he said to me he had always wanted to talk to a philosopher, and when he found out that that's what I do, he had all kinds of questions. And it turned out that he had a colleague at work who was a Christian. And he said, we're friends, but we don't agree on anything, including the existence of God. And he said, so I'm wondering, you're a philosopher, can you give me some ammunition? Can you believe that? And I said, I think you came to the right place. And then we had a conversation he did not see coming about the evidence for Christian belief. And, one of the things I asked him early on is I said, well, if he's a Christian and he believes that God exists and you disagree with him on that, what is it that you believe instead? You've heard this question before tonight already. And it's a great way to actually get into where a person is coming from, and that's that listening side, is to hear what their perspective is and know what your interaction is with exactly, because there are a variety of options out there. And so it was very interesting to hear him describe his point of view, but the assumption was that because this guy teaches philosophy at a university and has a PhD in philosophy, he's probably on my side, right? There's no such thing as a Christian philosopher, right? That's an oxymoron, or some kind of moron anyway. So, that can't be this. But what I'm going to be doing tomorrow is trying to show you not what all the individual arguments look like in detail. We couldn't do that in one session. But to show you how you can start here and move to this argument because it builds on another argument, stands on its shoulders, as it were, and then these two compare the weight of the next thing that you're doing, and it's kind of a sequence that you can use as a paradigm in your own thinking and adapt it to different situations. Even when it comes to the question, does God exist, there are many different evidences. We have an embarrassment of riches in the area of evidence for God's existence. I'm not exaggerating that from my point of view. I'm truly convinced of that. And when somebody says, well, give me a reason to believe that God exists, I have to think through, well, where do I start? Which one am I going to, use in this person's case? If they're into the sciences, then I know where to start. I have some ideas about that. But maybe they're not. Maybe it's something else. On the other hand, I do think that some arguments are better starter arguments. They're like kindling to build a fire. And you add logs, substance, as you get the kindling going. You understand that analogy. And before long, the thing is blazing and warm, and you're getting the result that you're looking for. But when you just start the fire initially, it's hard to visualize how this is actually going to help me stay warm in the cold. That's because you have to start at an auspicious, minimal level where there's going to be the least threat to the person that you're talking to and the greatest potential for agreement. And then you build on that. And you see where it goes. For example, one of the things that I find helpful is with people who say, you know, because of evil in the world, I have a hard time believing that there's a God. Right? And then they say, not only that, I have problems with the concept of miracles. And I want to say, no, wait a minute. What if there is a God, but it takes a miracle for him to solve the problem of evil? Like the resurrection of Jesus, for example. You see, can you really have it both ways? And there's a lot of things like that, the dynamics, the dialectic, the rhetoric, that we just don't have time for in one weekend. But I want to give you a structural paradigm for like a way to think about how the evidence can incorporate all the new things that you're learning. You go to the next year's conference, come back next year, and you hear an argument for something. You say, now what's that paradigm again? And you look at the paradigm and you think, I'll bet you that argument could fit in really neatly at this stage in the whole series of reasoning. So more about that tomorrow. And then there's the whole practical dimension of how do we actually talk to people. This was what we were hearing about in the previous session so effectively described. You know, you'll see in my definition of Christian apologetics that our effort needs to be winsome. It's not in order to take scalps, win arguments, or just fight about who's right and who's wrong. Right? The goal of our instruction, Paul says, is love. That's the goal. We seek to reconcile men and women to Christ. Do you know what that means? Bring peace between them and God. Well, how are you going to do that if it's dukes up all the time? White knuckles. You know? But look, we shouldn't flinch from telling the truth. And we can learn a lot from Jesus about how we do these things. That's a wonderful study in itself, is just to see how Jesus viewed the plausibility of his own message and how he sought to help others see what was plausible about it too. On what basis did Jesus Christ commend his message to the world? On what basis did he do it? Now, we want to emulate that, don't we? So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to step into the middle of this paradigm that you'll get tomorrow and just pull out one category of argumentation for one basic thing, and that is that there is a God that has to do with moral experience, human moral experience. There are lots of different ways to reason to the existence of God. And by the way, I think that many arguments for God's existence are ways of synthesizing intuitions that people have, evidences that they maybe haven't thought about very rigorously, but the argument helps you get to the bare bones of what is persuasive here. The persuasion can come in other ways. It doesn't have to take the form of an argument. An argument structure might have two premises and a conclusion. One of the simplest forms of argument there is. And there are varieties of these. Syllogisms. So you can have an if-then statement as your first premise. If P, then Q. P just represents some proposition and Q represents some other proposition. It could be unexpected. It could be if the sky is blue, then God exists. Okay? If P, that is, if the sky is blue, then Q, That is, God exists. You might never have heard an argument that started that way. But then if you wanted the conclusion that God exists, what would the second premise be? The sky is blue. Right? Now, you'd have to argue for these premises and have sub-arguments for them, but it's a basic, simple structure. The simple structure may not be how a person actually comes to believe in God. Read the premises, evaluate the premises, decide on the validity of the argument, and if you agree that the premises are true and the argument is valid, bingo, you're ready to believe in God. Not that it works that way, but the argument crystallizes, right, impressions, ideas, thoughts, beliefs, evidences that you've accumulated, and boils it down to the bare bones so that you can see through all the fog and all the thickets how the inference is supposed to work. And so it isn't always going to be the case that you're going to give an argument using numbered premises and conclusions and talking about your P's and Q's, these propositions that are built into the argument. But they can be very handy for you to know how to pull that out and use it, pull it out and use it in a situation. So that's why they'll take the form that they do. You're trying to clear the basic move, the inferential move, of all the extra detritus or debris or just rhetorical flair and boil it down to just the essentials of the argument so that you know what it is you're doing whenever you deploy that kind of line of thought. So this is called a moral argument for God's existence. There are other arguments for God's existence that have different departure points. Cosmological arguments for God's existence are called that because God is thought by these various ways of reasoning to be the best way to explain the existence of the cosmos, the universe. Now that's just to explain its existence, why there is something rather than nothing. There are other arguments that look at particular features of the universe, physical properties of the universe, that give evidence of design in the universe, and these are sometimes called design arguments. Because you can see evidence of design, you look for a designer to explain those features of the universe. Now you're not just trying to explain the being of a universe, but the being of a universe that has certain properties. Any universe that exists might need some sort of creator to explain its existence, but it's this universe that we want to explain, and we can learn more about what God is like by looking at its various properties, and our encounter with the world, and our experience of the world. And our experience of the world is variegated. We experience the physical world. We go out on a ferry into the Puget Sound towards, San Juan Island, and come around and tuck into Friday Harbor, and we see the beauty, and we think, oh my goodness, this beauty, how do you explain that? Right? Or just the complexity of molecules or features of the human body, whatever, also are physical evidences that indicate some kind of being that intended that things be this way. So there's that. But then there are other kinds of arguments, like arguments from things that don't even have a physical existence, like minds. Human minds are not physical objects. But they come from something. How do human minds come to be and have the properties that they have? And how do they interact with physical objects like bodies, brains? How does the mind and the body relate to each other? Maybe that's some evidence, not only that there is a God, but evidence that tells us something more about what God is like and what He's up to in creating a world that contains individuals with minds. Now, another feature of human experience is morality. Morality. Moral judgments, moral instincts, if you will, moral convictions, and the desire to be a morally good person. Even if there's disagreement about what that is pervasive within the human condition. To live the good life. Understood in different ways by different people, but all of us concerned with morality. We are, in a certain sense, morally serious beings. And we pass moral judgment on our members of our human community, don't we? And we feel guilt, which is passing judgment on our own selves, morally speaking. So morality is a big part of human experience. And if we contemplate aspects of the human moral situation, we may have further evidence, first, that there is some sort of God that accounts for this reality, but also says something more about what God is like and what interest he might take in the human condition. You understand? So I am excerpting from a larger paradigm, kind of from an early stage in the paradigm, but not the beginning of the paradigm, a kind of argument that we're just going to focus on for a little while this evening. The moral argument for God's existence. There are versions of this argument. Now, that's what building a cumulative case is about, is that you add evidences on top of evidences. And at each stage, you reach some sort of preliminary conclusion, and then you use that in the next stage to reason deeper into the topic. And it's an accumulation of evidences that lead you further and further. I think of it as a funnel. So you start with an open-mouthed funnel at the top where you pour very general information and you get a certain specific result. And then you use that along with new information to narrow the focus of your discussion until it zeroes in a more precise way on a particular point. And I'm not going to say more about that because that's for tomorrow. But building a cumulative case for God's existence includes collecting evidences of various types, cosmological, design, arguments from consciousness, or moral experience, combined in such a way that we have a richer concept of God and not just a single claim that God exists. Every argument that God exists tells you something about what God is like. It isn't just an argument that God exists. And some arguments for God's existence will only tell us so much. And in order to have a complete conception of God, grounded in the evidence available to us, we need a variety of points of reference. So that together, these will tell us that much more about what God is like, so that our concept of God is that richer. Okay? So now, what I'm going to give you tonight in the form of moral arguments for God's existence will actually make additional sense in light of tomorrow's discussion, where we can say, now see, drop that argument in here and see how that advances the case in the next step. Okay? Sorry about the sequence being that way, but that's just how it turns out. Now, what I want to do here, well, okay, building a cumulative case. So normally what I would do is I would begin with a cosmological argument of the sort I described a moment ago, and then I would proceed to various forms of design argument to enrich my understanding of what God is like. And then I would move on to perhaps moral arguments for God's existence. And then there are varieties of other arguments. And there are all sorts of arguments for God's existence. Let me skip over a couple of elements here just about how explanation and arguments work. Other arguments might be, this is the same slide that I had a minute ago, but other arguments might include such things as these arrows illustrate the progression. Actually, no, I'm going to stop right there with that, because that goes into versions of cosmological argument here. Let's just do this. Let's go to moral arguments. Okay? So this is part of this is part of a whole course in Christian apologetics. If I teach this course, I begin with my definition, I lay out the paradigm, and then we start looking at the arguments in detail. Now we're going to jump into the middle of the course and talk about one class of arguments, moral arguments for God's existence. And one way to talk about this is by asking the question, is God necessary for morality? Is God necessary for morality? In fact, I think that might be the title that you gave to this, Dwayne, for this evening's presentation. Last night we were talking to a person that we don't know well. We've met before, but only had occasion to speak with her. She was introduced to us by a friend of ours, and we were all having dinner together last night, and she had heard from my friend that I would be giving a series of lectures this weekend. And so she asked me, what will you be speaking about? Well, I don't know her background, but she has a certain flair for using certain sorts of words, and I did suspect that she probably didn't have the same worldview that I do. I still can't be sure that that's entirely the case, but I went with that assumption. It's a safer assumption. And I said, well, I'm going to be talking about evidence for things that matter, why we should have good reasons to believe the things that we believe about the things that matter most. I said my second talk is going to be about the relationship between God and morality and whether God is necessary for morality. And I said, now I don't mean this. I don't mean, can you be moral if you don't believe in God? Right? I believe you can be. Now that doesn't mean you're not a sinner, right? But sinners can do the right thing, right? And they can have moral convictions and moral qualms and actually be morally responsible beings. That is possible, even as sinners. That's true whether you're a sinner sanctified by grace or a sinner not yet sanctified by grace. Either way, you're a sinner. And we all face that dilemma of doing the right thing when our inclinations might be to do the wrong thing. No, when I talk about whether God is necessary for morality, I'm not saying whether you can be moral if you don't believe in God. I'm saying whether there can really be a universe where morality matters if there is no God. You see the difference? Now you might think that you don't need God in order for morality to matter, and then be a good person and do things that God would actually want you to do without actually believing in God. Now, listen, believing in God is one of the things God does want you to do. And so there is something immoral about denying the existence of God. That reflects a kind of moral rebellion on the human part. But that's not the point of this argument, okay? We're just talking about whether a world where morality has significance, meaning, and purchase in our lives, if there is no God. And I'm going to argue that it's hard to make sense of that without God. That's going to be my argument. Now, there are really two arguments that I want to talk about. And the first one, I'm going to give it to you largely to set it aside. And I'll tell you why I'm setting it aside in a moment. It's the argument for making sense of moral facts. We'll have to talk about what a moral fact is and how moral facts need to be explained and how difficult it is to explain them except in terms of some kind of supernatural entity or agency or consciousness or moral law giver. The second category, the one that interests me especially, and that I'll spend more time on tonight, is making the connection between moral facts and moral agents and how you need God in order to do that. So these are two different kinds of arguments, both of them having to do with moral facts, but one tries to make sense of the being or the reality of moral facts. The other one tries to make sense of how moral facts connect up with moral agency, our actions, and why we are morally responsible individuals. That, I think, is an especially compelling consideration. But here's the first argument. Premise number one. There are objective moral facts. What do we mean by that? Well, there are such moral facts as it is morally wrong to torture. This is an example that's often given by theists and others. Theists are those who believe that God exists. And this is a view that's given by theists who believe that there's a good moral argument for the existence of God. Moral facts include things like torturing a baby at the end of a bayonet just for fun is morally wrong. Now, why would we use an example like that? It's so gruesome and so awesome. Well, that's why. And it's so gruesome and so awesome that you expect most people to resonate with the claim and agree with it. Right? Who's going to disagree with that? Who's going to admit to disagreeing with that? Right? So, most people would agree that that's morally wrong, and it's objectively morally wrong. Now, there are subjectivists and there are relativists who will make a show of disagreeing with it, and you could say, well, then this argument isn't for them, or you could say, I just don't believe it. And I expect you to be bothered by this argument later when you're alone and trying to go to sleep with your private thoughts, not what you're telling me. And by the way, I think that's good apologetics. I think there are things that we can say to people, and we do it in a winsome way, not antagonistically, but for the sake of coming to repentance even. Being told by them, oh, I don't believe that, and they just reject it, but I believe they're haunted by it later on. They go to sleep wondering, should I believe that or not? Did I actually make a good case for not believing that? They don't have to be honest with us. All that matters is whether they're honest with themselves. And that, I think, we can sort of hope for, regardless of how they present themselves, and do our best to just present the truth as persuasively as we can. And let the Spirit of God do His part. Okay? And that could be keeping this fellow or this woman awake at night, wondering if they're making a mistake. But the point is that there are objective moral facts. And if you find somebody who says, well, I don't believe that. I don't believe there are any objective moral truths that apply everywhere and at all times to every person. Fine. Then you say, well, I guess this argument's not for you. But you're kind of a rare, sort of odd duck if you don't believe that there are any objective moral facts. And you might not like me for giving you this argument, which might be some evidence that you believe that there are objective moral facts, because you think I'm a bad person for doing this. All right? So you can go there. The second premise is that objective moral facts are either natural phenomena or they are non-natural phenomena. And then the third premise tells us what it would mean. Well, you could then elaborate on what that would mean. A natural phenomenon would be something that could be explained naturally. It could be explained in terms of the sciences or psychology or maybe sociology. Okay? And if a phenomenon cannot be explained in terms of those kinds of things, like biology or physics, the hard sciences, or in terms of our psychology, right? What it is to be human and how humans function and operate emotionally, psychologically, or sociologically, where you take people in the aggregate and you talk about how society determines how things operate, how things are. If you can't explain objective moral facts in one of those ways, then you don't have a natural explanation for it. You're going to have a non-natural explanation. And so the third point is that objective moral facts are not natural. They cannot be explained in terms of the sciences, in terms of biology. It's not purely a function of human biology that these facts are what they are. You could have facts like this even if there weren't human beings. It might be theoretical, but still true, that if there were human beings, if there were babies, and then there were people who might torture them with bayonets for their own pleasure, then that would be morally wrong. That's a moral fact whether there actually are babies, or whether there actually are any individuals in the world who would contrive to torture babies in that way for their own pleasure. It might be a world that's made up of purely inanimate objects, but the fact that that would be morally wrong is a prescription for any world where entities of that sort might exist, you see. And that can't be explained just in terms of our biology. It can't be explained in terms of physics. There's no chemical explanation for this fact being what it is. It's also not just a matter of our psychology where we say, well, that's just my preference. No, we don't believe that fact depends upon how I feel. Now, my feelings might draw attention to what I believe, but I don't confuse the fact and what I believe about the fact with how I feel if I contemplate somebody doing such a horrible thing. So it's not reducible to subjective personal feelings. It's not a psychologically, you can't give a fully satisfactory psychological explanation for there being these moral facts. Now, there is a psychological reaction to the possibility of it or the portrayal of it, whether it's in fiction or in film or in fact. We might find it repulsive right, to contemplate. But that repulsion doesn't explain what makes it a moral fact. Actually, it's the moral factuality of it, together with our emotional constitution, that explains why we find it so repulsive. The fundamental moral fact is more basic than the emotional response we have to it. All right? So it's not explained psychologically, nor is it explained sociologically. It would say, well, my community happens to disapprove of torturing babies that way. And that's all it means for it to be a moral fact. We don't think that. We think that any society that would approve of it would be morally corrupt or morally reprobate. There would be something morally repugnant about a society that approved of it. And that's because it's not a question of whether a society approves it or not that determines that it's a moral fact. It's a moral fact in and of itself. You see? Well, if there's no natural explanation for objective moral facts, and some explanation is required, and the only alternative to a natural one is a non-natural one, then presumably we need a non-natural explanation for moral facts. And when you go looking for a non-natural explanation for moral facts, you have to say either, this is the argument, they are brute facts, they just exist in and of their own right with no explanation whatsoever, or there's some non-natural entity external to the natural world that determines the content of moral facts. And that would be God. So it's either a brute fact with no explanation, that's not explanatorily satisfactory, right? No explanation for something that you would think needs one. So the best explanation is non-natural, and the details would go into saying that must be a being that makes them to be what they are. So a moral law would have a moral law maker. Right? You've heard this. It's the argument to a moral lawmaker from the existence of moral laws, except I've been talking about them in terms of moral facts. These moral facts are laws or law-like in this sense. They are prescriptive when entities that are referred to within the framework of the law, the fact as described, actually exist. So if you have a human being, or you have babies, and you have individuals who have bayonets, and they think corruptly that their pleasure will be maximized by torturing these infants in this way, then the prescriptive content of the moral fact applies to those people. You see that? So it has application, because there are actual people who might do such a corrupt, horrible thing. All right. Now, this argument is only inferring the existence of God from the mere reality of moral facts. It's the simple fact that there are objective moral truths that have nothing to do with our psychiatry, our sociology, our biology, our chemistry, our physics, or anything like that. They have to be external to all of that. And you're looking for an explanation for them, and that explanation, it would seem, says this theist, be best provided in terms of a moral lawgiver. Now, this raises certain problems, because then people say, well, what's the relationship between a moral lawgiver and the laws that the moral lawgiver gives? It's the age-old problem raised by Plato in a dialogue that he wrote called the Euthyphro. Now, I don't know why anybody, even in ancient Greece, would call his child Euthyphro, but somebody did, at least hypothetically, because this is named for an individual fellow who met up with Socrates and had this argument about the relationship between the divine and the good. And the question was, is what is right because God makes it so? God intends it? Or does God intend it to be so because it is so in its own right, objectively, independently of God? And you get problems either way. And this is one of the difficulties with the argument, is if anybody who knows of the so-called Euthyphro problem or the Euthyphro dilemma can raise this and say, well, do you believe that what makes an action right or wrong is God's will? Or does God will it because it's right or wrong? And if you say the latter, it sounds like God is somehow subordinate to the moral law, And if you make it the other way around, it sounds like the moral law can be whatever God wants. And that could be completely arbitrary. That's the worry. Now, there are ways of dealing with that worry that I'm not actually going to go into because I'm not particularly fond of this argument. And the reason why I'm not particularly fond of it is that I think that a naturalist can accept the existence of moral facts as abstract objects that are not part of the physical world without being a theist. And that I don't even know what it is we're looking for when we say we have to have an explanation for those things. Because they're abstract objects. It's like, well, they don't have like physical existence, moral truths. They could just be like fundamental principles that would apply if you had a physical world and it had certain properties. But that's like a total conditional. It's like logic. Does God have to create logic for there to be logic? Or is it just that logic is what it is with no application whatsoever? It's just totally ethereal, besides being purely abstract, if there's no physical world. Right? And so I do know naturalists who believe in objective moral truths. They don't think that God has anything to do with it, and it's very hard for me to explain to them why some sort of explanation for those is needed. Is it a causal explanation? Do you need God in order to explain how moral facts come into existence? I don't think they just come into existence. Now, I don't think they're eternal existing objects with the kind of ontology that would make them God because they were always there. But that's a peculiarity about abstract truths or abstract objects, right? They're more like things that have a certain kind of application if other things are true. So I struggle to make sense of the idea that you need any kind of explanation for the existence of moral facts. Now, why do I even bother with this argument if that's how I feel about it? Well, so I could take up some important time. Right? My other argument doesn't take enough time, so I have to put some other stuff in there that I don't believe in. That's not the reason. The reason is because this is probably currently the most popular argument for moral argument for God's existence in contemporary Christian evangelical apologetics. It's partly because a friend of mine, William Lane Craig, is a great advocate of this argument. And I just happen to have a disagreement with him. And so if I'm tasked with giving you a version of the moral argument that I accept, well, I feel like not only must I give you what that is, but I should probably say what it is that motivates me to look elsewhere for a good moral argument. And in fact, I didn't come up with this moral argument because I was looking for an alternative. I just think it's a very good moral argument. And now I want to give it to you. But I think it's good for you to know that theologians don't always agree with each other about everything. That apologists don't always agree with each other about everything. There is a growing consensus. I'm concerned about this, frankly, that there's a growing consensus within the evangelical apologetics community that evidence of near-death experiences is evidence for our Christian worldview. I don't think it is, myself, but a number of people do. And so I'm becoming more vocal talking about it, and I actually think that's more concerning to me, the drift in that direction, than accepting a moral argument that I think is not as good as another one. And one reason for that, and now this is my little detour into NDE stuff, but one reason for that is a lot of the testimonies, well, first of all, near-death experiences count as evidence of the testimonial sort, right? So you believe it on the basis of the testimony of others unless you had that experience yourself, right? The problem with having the experience yourself is it's based on memory, and you're remembering something during a period during which you are supposed to be unconscious. So calling it memory creates special problems of its own, even for the person who thinks they had this experience. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have the experience, but it does raise the question whether the experience correlates with what they think they were experiencing. And you can have experiences of things that aren't objectively correlated with things as they seem to be during the experience, right? Psychedelic drugs do that, medications do that, other kinds of delusional experiences do that, and I would think that when the body is undergoing the most severe trauma it ever has, and that's why they are having a near-death experience, and only then do they have it, that it's not entirely clear what you're remembering and what's being fabricated here. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that there are patterns of experience being reported, right? And I'm aware of all this. Believe me, I know all about that, and yet I still don't find it totally convincing. It doesn't mean that I think that it'll never become valuable evidence, but I don't think it has that value yet. It's premature to put as much stock in the evidence as some of my apologist friends, and I do mean friends, believe. Now, I'm not alone either in questioning the value of this evidence. I also have other apologist friends that concur with me that this is problematic. But one of the problems is that if you take the testimony seriously, you have to include in it the panoply of testimony, or the whole pattern of testimony that you find among many of the witnesses in the most celebrated cases. And in my own reading of some of these cases by the individuals themselves, that is, people who purport to have these experiences, many of them also report various kinds of occultic experiences, unrelated to the near-death experience, but still part of their overall pattern of life and consciousness. And it's remarkable to me that Christian apologists have neglected to address this component in their total testimony. And that, to me, is, I think, has to be brought into discussion. What we do with it is another matter. All I'm saying, though, is I'm giving you now 2 examples of cases where, as an apologist who's thought about these things, and I don't want to give arguments that I'm not fully persuaded of, and I want to caution my colleagues in the community when I think that an argument might prove to be maybe backfire or problematic in certain ways. That's why I'm taking exception. And I think it would be wise for all of us to realize that we can't just take our intellectual representatives' word for things, even when they all seem to agree with each other. And disagreement is a good way to remind us that it's more complicated. Okay? Now, I suspect the ones who favor this argument, this moral argument, coming back to it, will not necessarily disagree with the argument I'm about to give you. So that might help you as well. You might think, oh, well, I'm not stuck believing, accepting one rather than the other. If I go with this one, then I can't use Geivett's. Or if I go with Geivett's, then I have to throw this one out. No, my argument that I'm about to give you does not entail that this argument is a bad argument. I just happen to think it's not as compelling for the reasons that I gave you. Okay? Now, is this a little more technical than the first conversation we had tonight? I understand that. And listen, some of this is hard work. It just frankly is hard work. And it takes a lifetime of devotion to the study of these things and dialogue with other people and to see what the stakes are and what the possible problems are and all that. And so I want ultimately this argument to be useful to you, which it won't be if it doesn't make sense to you. And so I'm going to launch into it anyway, and I'm going to hope for the best, and we'll see what happens here. But here's one thing that might help. I suspect that we've got people here tonight who are comforted to hear from intellectual representatives of our shared tradition that there are good arguments for things that sound like they make sense, but you might feel like, I don't think I fully understand the argument, and I'm pretty sure I couldn't really give the argument to somebody else. And if I did, I'm not sure they would understand it, even if I did. You might feel that. Is that a loss? Not necessarily, if you think, it's just nice to know that we've got stuff like that going on in our community. Okay? That's number one. Number 2 is, you might think, well, let's hear the argument first. I might actually be able to follow it. Whether I can share it with somebody else and remember how it goes in detail and be able to answer follow-up questions and all that, that's another matter. but I might find it personally very convincing. Well, that's another level of benefit that you can get if that's where you are in this. Finally, there may be a few who would say, my goodness, I like that argument. I should have had that argument in my back pocket yesterday when I was talking. I know exactly how that would have helped. And then you go off and use it. We're all in different places in this. And it doesn't matter whether it's this argument or some other evidence about the resurrection of Jesus or whatever else it is, right? There are different ways that we can incorporate the lessons that come when our spokespersons, our representatives, come and say, hey, give this some thought, see if this might be useful to you. And that's how I offer it to you. Okay? So let's get into it. Hey, what's the time on this here? What's my...
Just go.
9:30. No. When do
Just
we
get
end?
done. 9:30.
Oh, right. Okay. Now I see why you said that.
No,
Okay.
just go. Just go. Just go. I got it figured out. I'm audible.
Okay, you good.
Yeah.
You good. I'm good. Making the connection between moral facts and moral agents. This is the second argument. We have to know what a moral fact is, and I've already talked about that. I'll remind you in a moment. And we've got to know what a moral agent is. Okay? And that's the easy side, actually. A moral fact, again, is something abstract. It's not concrete. It's not physical. It doesn't exist in the physical world. It's a truth of a certain sort, like the one I gave you. I hate to keep repeating it. So I'll just say, remember the one I gave you?
Yes.
About the baby. But there are all sorts of moral facts, and there are controversies about many of them, maybe most of them. Some of them are highly controversial. We have a huge debate in this country about abortion, right? Mm-hmm. And you might think it's a moral fact that abortion is always morally wrong. Or you might say, no, that depends on circumstances. There are exceptions. Or you might think it's really never wrong. I mean, there's a moral fact that women have a right to make a choice, even if it means the elimination of a fetus. Okay? It's a whole gamut. What I'm saying, though, is there are moral facts. And you and I might disagree on them, but if we can agree that there are moral facts, even if we disagree about what they are, that's all this argument requires. Okay? But you have to understand that the moral facts are not physical things. They're not just ideas. They're not just concepts. They have real existence and purchase, in a certain sense of that term I'll come to, as abstract objects. Concrete objects, in contrast, are physical things, like this portfolio, or this book called the Bible, or this iPhone, this smartphone, said with qualifications, smartphone. All right? And there are all these objects in the world, and they're physical objects. And these objects interact with each other in certain ways because of physical laws. You have cause and effect, right? That happen among physical objects. If I throw this with enough force at somebody in this room and it hits them in the head, I might get sued. Because they might get a headache, they might lose an eye, any number of things could happen. And that's how the world of concrete objects actually works. They don't have to be made of concrete in order for these relations to obtain. They could be something as soft and cushiony as a ball of cotton, and it interacts physically with the world. You push your finger on it and it depresses. It changes the shape of the thing. That's a causal interaction between your finger and the thing. Causal interactions are things that we're very familiar with in the physical world. They don't happen, they don't operate, there are no causal interactions in the world of abstract objects. Abstract objects do bear relations to each other, but they're not physical relations, and they do not include causal interaction. I'll give you an example. Numbers. Suppose numbers exist. Are they physical, concrete objects? No. Now notice, in the previous slide, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all numbered there. Those look physical to me. Aren't they physical?
The TV is
Yes, they're physical, right?
The TV is.
Well, the TV, but if I take a pencil and I write a number 1 on the pad,
It's the graphite.
right? Graphite, but there's a physical representation of a number, but not a number. Numbers are not physical. Numerals are. Right? So a numeral is a representation of the number 1. That numeral 1 up there, we say, oh, number 1. Not a number. It represents the number. And it's used a certain way in convention to be the first in the series. And 2 is the second. So on. But the numeral is not to be confused with the number. You can have physical numerals, but you cannot have physical numbers. And there's a controversy in philosophy about whether numbers exist. Okay? Not only numbers, and by the way, numbers stand in relations to each other, right? Number 1 is smaller than number 2. You get 2 1s, you get, well, how can there be 2 1s if they're not concrete objects? There isn't more than 1 1. There's only 1 1. And there's only 1 2. There's only 1 3. And yet, you can add 1 and 2 and get 3. How many times can you do it? As many times as you want. Well, then that would make a lot of 3s. No, that's not how it works. Because you're confusing, right, mathematical operations with numbers themselves. But the number 3 is greater than, in a certain sense, the number 2. And number 2 greater than the number 1. So there are real relations that hold between numbers, but they're not causal. Numbers don't do things. And you don't have to worry about like running into them in your car. Or finding them extra ones in your purse somewhere. Right? That's not how they work. They don't interact with the world that way. And yet engineers make good use of numbers when they build bridges. So there's a physical realm in which numbers have application, but they're not to be confused with the realm, and they bear no causal relations with the physical world. Can you make sense of that? Okay, that's great. Moral facts are the same kinds of things, but they're not numbers. They're not, and the relations are going to be different. How about red? Now this might be red or not. Let's just stipulate that it is, or we could say this young lady's blouse is red. Don't need to have anybody's like, oh, how about your shoes? I don't know about the shoes. How about the keyboard up there? Everybody can see that. Is that red? Let's say it's red. All right? What about redness? Is that redness or is that red?
Redness.
It's red, right? So somehow redness gets into that object in the physical world, but redness as a thing is not physical. And it doesn't cause that to be red. Okay, now that's a universal, they're called. Universals. Dogness. You don't see dogness, ever. But you see dogs. Right? And dogs have one thing in common. What is it? You got it, dogness. Right? And then there's a, believe it or not, of course you believe it, philosophers disagree about whether redness exists and whether dogness exists. In other words, whether universals are real objects or just names for things. We're not getting into that. All we're saying is there's all kinds of things that are abstract objects, some of which may be actually existing things, others of which may not be, but they're controversial. Now I'm treating moral facts as if they're real things, but they exist in an abstract realm where causal relations do not hold. Okay? That's moral facts, and that's why we've got the arrow pointing up from abstract objects. You've got to understand that's the kind of thing they are. Now, what's a moral agent? Well, we can point to examples. That's one way to define something is by ostension. Ostensive definition is when you point to something and say, that is a smartphone. You say, well, that's not much of a definition, but it is a way to find out what, and you get enough of these, and then you start working out, well, what do they have in common? You start to say what a definition is in a more, like dictionary sense. You, and you, and you, and you, and I are moral agents. Okay? We act as agents in the world to do different things. And among the things that we can do are perform moral acts. Moral acts are actions that have a moral quality that is either good or bad or neutral. morally neutral when we do them. Lying, some say, is always wrong. That's the moral texture of the act of lying in every case. Or it could be that sometimes it's justified. Maybe it's the lesser of two evils and you have to do one or the other. And so that's not actually evil. And so on. So you get disagreement about that, but the point is that you, as an agent, right, can do something in the world that has a character that is moral. It is tinged with moral significance. It is either right morally or wrong morally. What makes it so has something to do with moral facts. What's interesting is that moral facts ground judgments about agents. So that if the agent does something that falls under the normative power of this abstract object called a moral fact, right, then the act has that moral property in the actual world, this world, not the abstract world, but the world of human experience. You understand this? Now, there's causal efficacy, causal agency in the world of concrete objects. When I do something, it has an effect in the world. And oftentimes when I do something that has moral significance, whether it's praiseworthy or blameworthy, that is good or bad, it oftentimes has rippling effects. And they can outlast me. Right? And we live in a world where that's a fact. You and I suffer the consequences of actions that other people perform and they're not even around anymore. Maybe we never even knew them. It could have been generations ago. Okay? So, yes, there's a lot of moral activity going on in the world, even though at the level, the fundamental level of moral facts, there's nothing going on. Now, here's the question. How do you explain this correlation between these abstract objects called moral facts and our moral agency? When moral facts do not bring moral agents into the world, they do not cause moral agents to do the things they do, and they do not cause the actions to be morally right or morally wrong, and yet they have prescriptive normative force in our assessment of agents and their actions. Good agents, bad agents. Good actions, bad actions. How so? Because of moral facts. So why, if a world where there are moral agents and moral events that occur because of our actions, why is there such a world in the first place? That is, in a certain sense, governed by abstract objects that have no causal power. They don't bring anything into existence. They don't cause the existence of a human community with moral responsibilities and the capacity for doing good and evil. They're just prescriptive in the nature. They're like instructions for what makes the world good or bad, or features of the world good or bad, but they have no other bearing on the world. So why is there a world like that? Now, I want to say it's very peculiar on a purely scientific, naturalistic view of the world, which tries to explain everything in our experience in terms of natural selection. Right? How do you explain the connection between moral facts and moral agents in terms of natural selection or any other scientific phenomenon? And I say you can't do it. You'd have to find some physical causal connection between these things, and that is going to require something external to the realm of physical objects. And it's not going to be reducible to anything at the realm of abstract objects, but you know what will do it? You know what could do that? A creator, a divine being, who, with full knowledge of moral facts, intends the existence of a world where they have application. where now people fall under the prescriptive force of moral facts that have no causal power in their own right. But because God creates them, it is His will. And it's not only His will, but it's inherent in the nature of moral facts and our relation to them, that we are culpable when we do the wrong thing, even without a God. But where God comes in is He makes us so that we can be that way. And that, I think, cannot be explained scientifically. You think you can kind of wrap your mind around this? Okay, if you can do that and then share it with each other, talk to other people, say, hey, what do you think about this idea? Then you don't have to explain the existence of moral facts, which might be complicated and difficult and maybe impossible because it's not necessary. But something needs to explain why we have moral qualms in the first place. Now, there's a couple other things that you need to know about this. They're on top of this. You can do this argument without these added bonus points. But here's bonus point number one. When you and I act morally, we act freely. There is no such thing as moral responsibility without freedom. Right? And that's why a lot of the law goes to the question, when that person did that horrible thing to that person over here, did they know what they were doing? Did they act freely? Because they're not morally responsible if they didn't do it on purpose. If they weren't free. Moral freedom is essential to moral responsibility. Well, where does freedom come from? Any kind of freedom. Moral freedom or any other kind of freedom. The freedom to pick up this book, turn the pages, and put it back down. Where does that come from? To be truly free is to be self-directed. I am not being determined by antecedent conditions or other forces in my environment or within my body or anything else to do those things. If that was the case, I would not be free. And if I was not free, I would not be morally responsible. So when I act freely, I could have done otherwise. And that's why I am morally responsible when I do the wrong thing. So now we've got to explain freedom. It's not just morality, but freedom. The second bonus, and I think you need God for that. Now, I found atheists say, you know what? I don't know if we need an explanation for that. Why not? Because I'm not sure what freedom is. I call that, this is a technical term, cop-out. Okay? That's a cop-out. I've had that happen in debate with atheists at universities, in front of their own students, at Detroit. I could get more specific. Now, one other bonus point. You want one more bonus to go home with? One other bonus is this. You and I can apprehend the content of moral facts. We can know what's morally right and morally wrong. We can know moral truths. How do we know them? How do we know them? They don't cause us to know them because they're not physical, they're abstract. So how do we know them? Somehow, we are aware of the content of moral facts. Even when we disagree, we have an awareness of it. And that, too, I think, means that we have to be constituted in a way that is not explained by natural selection, but by an intentional divine being who wanted there to be a world with critters like you and me in it so that we could be morally responsible, but that also becomes the precondition for moral goodness and moral fulfillment and morally significant relationships with each other, and that includes God Himself. Okay, so there you have a moral argument with two bonus points that you might like to try in addition to the first one we started.